Hello, welcome. My name is Jason Rader, and I am the head of the security practice for Insight Cloud and Data Center Transformation. And with me is Tunde Odole. Tunde?
Yes, good morning, everyone. So my name is Tunde. I lead our security testing business here within Insight CDCT, reporting up to Jason. Certainly look forward to this conversation here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. And so getting used to the technology, and I know that you guys are probably having to do the same thing with all of the different kind of constraints. We would have preferred to have been in the same room together, but technology, it's good stuff. So Tunde,
Absolutely.
You've recently produced a great document that I think everybody will have access to certainly after this, but it talks about how to protect against ransomware attacks, to cut straight to it. And, is that something we're still talking about? Is that something that clients are still struggling with a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. So just looking back to the last month and a half of some of the engagements that we've had to been pulled into, I would say over the last month, for example, we've had the unfortunate, I would say about 4 separate customers. We're dealing with all sorts of ransomware outbreaks, and that was really where it got us thinking. I mean, we got companies that are investing in all sorts of technologies. There's all sorts of point solutions. But then we started looking back and saying, okay, why are we still seeing this? And it became apparent both from our incident response engagements as well as some of the controls assessments that we were doing basic things, right? That there were certain commonalities that we found across the board, and we were able to deduce from that unless you get these areas right, there's no way to really stop the bad guys from getting into your environment. In security, we say it's not a matter of if, but when. The guys are going to get in at some point. The big question is, once they're in, what kind of level of effort does your environment really present to them, as far as exploiting and really doing some sort of damage to the environment? White paper came from.
And that's awesome. So I think, kind of playing the 80-20 rule like we normally do, I think we've got some tips that we're going to cover today that'll, at least get you 80% of the way there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a couple of things that kind of jump out. And obviously the idea here isn't to talk about every security strategy under the sun. The idea is just to focus on those things that we find as being impactful. Looking at things from a mature perspective for companies that don't have any kind of maturity, here are the areas that we would want to start with. And there are no specific orders. The very first thing that we talked to, that we kind of advocate, is your choice of endpoint security solution. I think for the most part, most businesses get that. But the problem is, and this is the unfortunate truth of the matter, all endpoint security solutions aren't created equal. That's something we've had to learn over time. What departments, they do an awesome job with slick marketing profiles and all that kind of stuff. So that's really where businesses are kind of at a difficult decision-making point, where you have to figure out, okay, which solutions actually work. And that's where you have to pay attention. We advise our customers to definitely want to take a look at publicly available ratings, but you also want to look at testing criteria as well, right? You want to look at if the different solutions are submitting. There's all sorts of available material that's out there. At the end of the day, you want to make sure that you engage someone or a trusted advisor, right, that really understands what endpoint security really means. As far as strategy is concerned, it's not just a matter of picking a tool. It's really all around the strategy, right? And picking the right tool is really important because, and I know I'm going to deviate here a little bit, if we look at the nature of breaches the ladder attack framework, that's the new buzzword that's out there. But frankly speaking, how many customers are really able to leverage that? It takes the most mature of organizations to even do anything with the framework specifically. Unless you have a pretty decent IR team, that's really where it comes in. So,
Right.
but you can leverage that. You can leverage that knowledge to decide or really to evaluate products to see, okay, based on what MITRE is saying, for example, here are the things that you would need to protect, break that process, that TTP process that attackers would typically engage in, and even taking that back, if you start to link it to even something as publicly available as a Lockheed Martin kill chain, for example, right? Using those two frameworks, for example, you could really use that to evaluate what sorts of tools should you really have at the endpoint. So at the end of the day, what we say is the endpoint is ground zero. From our perspective, it really doesn't matter. Don't let me say it doesn't matter, but organization perspective, I think is a better way to put it. The endpoint is more important generally than whatever you're doing from a firewall perspective, whatever you're doing from a network perspective, to be perfectly candid, for all sorts of reasons, right? We're consuming SaaS-based solutions and all that kind of stuff. So that's really how I would put it.
Thanks. And let me interject something. So, and I know the answer, but playing devil's advocate here. So is it safe to say that it's not just the endpoint, but it's how it's implemented, right? Like you mentioned a lot of programs that, people are buying based on this feature or that feature, and they have no mechanism to operationalize that within their organization. It's kind of like a waste of money, right?
Exactly right. And I'm glad you touched on that. It's not just the endpoint itself. That's why I use the phrase strategy. It has to do with how it's implemented. What features are you actually leveraging on the endpoint? And again, it goes to the broader endpoint strategy in and of itself. Because it's not just a matter of the point solution. There are other things that actually, we all understand the whole methodology, really. Applying that same mindset to the endpoint. Yes, the endpoint, the solution itself is key because you do have to leverage, there's a lot of intelligence that these solutions bring to the table that most companies would really have to invest in either some sort of managed services to get that kind of intelligence. So the good news is a fair amount of point solutions bring that to the table. And as far as remediation as well, that's also very important. The effectiveness actually, how is it implemented is very key. There's no sense in you buy a good product, but then it's improperly implemented or half the feature set. I can't tell you how many situations we've actually been in where we've seen that very situation come up. So yeah, you're exactly right. Implementation is important. Yeah.
And I think also we see folks who have needed a very specific feature set, not realize that it was available in the endpoint they already own. And I've seen stacks of endpoints on clients because they're just trying to attack a very specific thing that was important to the board or something like that. And they bought a product to sit on top of another product that they could have more effectively done.
Yeah, and that's also a very great point that you make, in that I've seen certain scenarios where there's an issue and the first thing the customer wants to blame is the endpoint. A lot of times it's really not the endpoint. Most of the time it's actually a people problem. The technology. So you're exactly right. You do have to. Obviously, you do. That's where the concept of really planning out these sorts of things. You just don't go out and buy an endpoint solution all because you attended a webinar or went to a seminar. That's not how it works. You really want to evaluate it. How does it fit? Are you able to manage it? Ease of use, effectiveness, those sorts of things. Those things are really very important in this area for sure. Yeah.
Perfect. And I know we could talk about this specific topic for days, but moving on to some of the other recommendations you had in your document, monitoring Active Directory changes. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so that was, again, based on what we've seen a lot of instances where the attackers would leverage, in this particular case, group policies to deliver the payload and obviously schedule a task somewhere in the future where pretty much everything goes nuts at the same time. And if you step back, if we look at one of the stuff they did with IBM, for example, from that analysis, the average dwell time for attackers in most environments is about 191 days. Now, if you look at it, that 191 days, they're not just drilling your environment for nothing. There's a lot of stuff that's going on at that point in time. There's a lot of planning. A lot of things that we've seen in the past is obviously they're going to do their reconnaissance, they're going to do their lateral movement, they're going to do a fair amount of CMC connections, all that good stuff. But they start to get into taking down some of those recovery controls that you would typically depend on. So we see a fair amount of, they would go after your backups, for example. There's a lot of incidents where they're pretty much just going to destroy your backups at that point. But as far as the final attack itself, it's usually staged with an Active Directory. But there's certain things that you could do, and obviously there's commercial tools, there are open source applications by which you can kind of monitor for Active Directory changes. But generally, you want to monitor for those password changes or even anything related to privileged accounts. Whenever any kind of privileged accounts is doing anything within your Active Directory environment, you certainly want to be monitoring for those, because those can actually be indicators of compromise or indicators of something really bad in the way. So that's kind of where that comes in. And there's several ways you can actually monitor for that. So,
of course. Now, I think it's interesting that, a lot of folks, we've been talking about these kinds of things for a long time, and a lot of folks don't necessarily try to monitor those, or if they do, they're not correlating that with other events that are happening in their environment. I mean, with group policy, you could push down malware, and then if somebody actually finds it and deletes it, it's persistent. The group policy will push it right back down. So it's one of those things.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Bad situation.
And to add to that, on that very point, one of the really bad things, well, don't let me say one of the bad, it's really how it's designed to work. One of the problems with group policies is that regardless of whatever hardening tool, and simply it can be used for nefarious purposes as well. If you look at it, no matter how much you harden your endpoint, for example, a lack of managing or monitoring your group policies, to your point, you could deliver payload, and guess what? It doesn't matter what you do from a firewall perspective or whatever. The endpoints are pretty much going to pull it down and pretty much execute it at that point. So yeah, you're exactly right. We see that all the time.
Well, cool. So moving on to another thing that we talked about. So I think this is something that's really interesting. I think one of the things that our incident response teams used to talk about is that servers don't browse and workstations don't serve. And you talk about having a workstation isolation strategy. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so you can kind of look at this from obviously, again, another new buzzword at this point is zero trust, but this is way before. This is what 1.0. You can kind of look at it from that perspective. But the idea here is this: if you look at general network communication, we typically have clients, which could be workstations or servers, talking to server resources. In this day and age, you've got them talking to the cloud, but that ideology is still the same: clients, servers, pretty much. But then the question is there ever any reason why clients should talk to each other, workstations to workstation? But then the problem with that is a lot of times when attackers get into the environment, there's usually what we call a patient zero. You compromise patient zero, but the next thing the attacker is going to do is literally lateral movement. That is achieved by moving from one workstation to another, exploiting vulnerabilities and all that kind of stuff until they get to their intended target or achieve whatever objective they got. If you look at it from that perspective, if you isolate workstations, and there's several ways to do this, and we'll get into this here, from each other, such that they don't trust each other, they only trust server resources, then guess what? You have effectively reduced the lateral move. You've pretty much taken the element of lateral movement out of the picture. So the only things the attackers can do at that point, if they've compromised patient zero, is really try to attack either some sort of a server resource or whatever. And then hopefully, my hope is you're doing some sort of monitoring, you're doing some sort of hardening on the server infrastructure as well, so that all of a sudden you identify that there's a malicious or there's a nefarious actor on the network. And then it's a lot easier to contain at that point, because you know exactly who to go look after, who to go clean up, and all that kind of stuff. So that's really where that came out of. And obviously that's supposed to be part of a broader hardening strategy. Hardening is one of those things that we haven't seen a lot of customers do very well. And from our perspective, it's really one of the most effective things that any business can be doing relatively cheaply, for that matter. So,
yeah, and I think one of the reasons why a lot of folks don't use a technique like isolating workstations is probably, and it's been available for a really long time, is that they're kind of, back in the old days where I remember when I first set up my first LAN, and you're setting up a server and you're like, okay, can everybody print? Can everybody get to the share? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm never going to touch this thing again. I don't want it to not be available for those resources. Of course, we've come 20 years in the future now, but I think a lot of folks are worried. There's a lot of background protocols and things going on. Even Windows updates can come from multiple machines on your network, and they're kind of concerned about maybe I'm going to brick something that might be. But that's where, again, you don't just go in and start clicking buttons and seeing what happens. That's where you actually need to use folks who've done it before and can help you with the strategy. Exactly
right. And I'm glad you touched on that, because this is where really understanding your network comes to play, right? In privacy frameworks, for example, there's a concept called of data flow analysis, right? To that very point, is it a good idea to be leveraging a workstation as a printer? I mean, there might be a specific use case for it, but generally the answer is no. If there is such a use case, that's really where the concept of exceptions come in. So in this scenario, for example, if a customer decided, okay, we want to implement a workstation isolation strategy, however, there are these designated workstations that have a dual function on the network, it's literally a matter of just creating exemptions. Nothing except it comes from these guys over here, pretty much. So that's really it. It's still a very effective strategy, and if you look at some of the cloud implementations as far as CASBs and stuff are concerned, it's that same mindset as well. Isolating environments, isolating pockets, unless you need to talk to them, kind of scenario. So,
yeah, and I agree. I think a lot of folks want the Ronco rotisserie grill, set it and forget it kind of approach. But, security isn't that way. Security isn't, we did it last year. We've got to continually kind of tune and those kinds of things. And again, it's more than just a technology that you set and forget. It's an ongoing program.
Exactly right. And the other thing to add to that is there's plenty of information that's out there as far as hardening standards are concerned. I mean, there's NIST, there's CIS, even Microsoft has got a plethora of it. So it's widely available. There are even tools that can actually automate a lot of this stuff for you. Obviously, you certainly want to test it out to make sure. Plenty of there's ample documentation on how to really do these things without necessarily crippling the business, but that customers can certainly take advantage of. Absolutely.
Awesome. So let's talk about vulnerability management. So are you talking about a product here?
So vulnerability management goes well beyond a product. Obviously, you certainly need, at the core of it, yes, you certainly need a product to do that automated correlation of reporting on those vulnerabilities. But vulnerability management kind of goes well beyond that. It's one thing to identify your vulnerabilities. It's another thing to fix them, because there's no sense in identifying vulnerabilities and you're really not doing anything about it. So hence the term vulnerability management. It's kind of like a cyclical process. You assess your vulnerabilities, you remediate them, and you continue, hence the term continuous. And that's really what we're talking about. And one of the things that we found is, again, for the companies that we had to assist, none of them were virtually doing anything of that sort. And it's one of those things that could actually be done rather inexpensively, to be perfectly candid. But it does require a dedication to the process around, okay, once we've identified certain vulnerabilities based on the severity levels, for example, triaging that, okay, are these vulnerabilities that we should, and this is where vulnerability prioritization comes to play, but really prioritizing which vulnerabilities you really need to deal with. That's impossible. You're never going to do that. But you do want to understand what kind of vulnerabilities you are dealing with, and then prioritizing which ones you go after. And obviously this gets into patching as well, because we all understand that patch management super, super, super important. But a lot of times the vulnerabilities that we have to deal with aren't necessarily patches alone. There's a lot of configuration related vulnerabilities, and the threat intelligence landscape changes by the minute. And there's no way you or I can conceivably these automated solutions will come in.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a big step that I think is missed in a lot of vulnerability management programs is it's, of course, 100% patching is not the nirvana of vulnerability management. Actually, that's a ridiculous goal in a lot of cases. What I think it's good from a vulnerability management perspective is being able to inform the business of the level of risk that they're exposed to. And that's where you start to show the value of how security is enabling the organization, because a certain amount of risk is acceptable, of course. And if we're about to do something big, mergers and acquisitions or those kinds of things, I want to know what kind of risk I'm exposed to organizationally before I start to do an endeavor that's going to, where a failure here is going to be way more of a big deal to me than if it was a normal operating environment, right?
Exactly right. And into that point, yes, a vulnerability management should really drive a broader risk management program. And you're exactly right. The idea is you're continuously feeding. Here is how the business is doing as far as identifying the vulnerabilities that we've got, but not just identifying, but we're actually remediating. So you pretty much want to see that bar graph trending lower left. It's kind of looks like lower right kind of scenario. That's really what you want to see. But yeah, the visibility to the business is very important. And to the mergers and acquisition, that's where some sort of any kind of a third party risk management also comes to play, right? And it really depends on how businesses. There's really no one size fits all as far as third party risk management. Mergers and acquisitions, you certainly want to know what kind of vulnerabilities or what kind of risks am I taking on by going through this merger or by standing up this new business offering or service offering or whatever that might be. Absolutely.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of stuff going on right now with that type of those type of risk assessments and even regulatory requirements coming out related to that. So a lot of folks are paying more attention.
Absolutely.
And so let's finish up your recommendations with talking about implementing multi-factor authentication, MFA.
Yep. So, MFA, how long have we been talking about MFA? We've been talking MFA for years now. It still amazes me, though, how many times you walk into organizations and there's no evidence of MFA as far as we can tell. But the fact of the matter is, MFA is important. It's not the silver bullet, obviously, but there's some general rule of thumbs that we take. Simply this: if it's externally facing, if it's a SaaS-based solutions, you definitely want to be doing MFA for everyone across the board, and that is also going to be driven by the sensitivity of the asset in question. I say sensitivity; it's really the importance of that asset to the business. So typical candidates for that would be any kind of CRM. Email is definitely a big one. It's one of the things we tell customers: if you're going to be putting email doing email as far as a SaaS, you don't want to do that without any kind of MFA for sure. But generally, anything externally facing, VPN connections obviously is also another very, very important one. You certainly want to secure that with MFA. We've seen a lot of attacks as far as remote desktop type connections or Citrix type connections and those sorts of things. Equally important. Internally, however, one of the things that we see is the rollout or the implementation of MFA internally tends to be a little bit have to do with logistically wise. It does take a certain amount of dedication to that, but at a minimum, one of the things that we recommend is if you are going to be doing MFA internally, you certainly want to do it for any kind of privileged accounts. So that would typically be any kind of administrative related account. You certainly want to tie that to any kind of a non-domain based account, but that are privileged in nature, whether it be for managing networking gear, firewall gear, or whatever that might be. You certainly want to do that because we see a lot of credential theft attacks internally in mitigating those. So that's kind of where MFA comes in.
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks don't realize that they might even have MFA capabilities that they've already paid for that they're simply not even using. And I've heard a stat that said, you can increase your security profile like 80% by just enabling MFA in some cases. So that's
right.
a really good thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because if we go back and look at some of the onto the original attack vector was just essentially some sort of externally facing asset that was compromised, and then you had credentials, either some sort of brute forcing or credential theft, however that could happen. But then once that user has trusted access in the environment, it's all downhill from there, because you got to remember they're doing this with a trusted identity. It's very difficult from a SIM perspective to pick up, okay, this is not, unless you're really doing some very good analytics, which again most companies never do. So you're exactly right. You're exactly right on that front. You certainly want to look at what you've got already. And to that point, a lot of SaaS-based solutions already have MFA built into it. Most companies just never, for one reason or the other. We've seen a lot of instances where it is never turned on until it's too late. They've already been burned. They've already lost funds. And now, but again, better late than never. But certainly.
Yeah, and I think, on the MFA, to talk a little bit about that, it's a great tool, but just like any tool, like we already talked about before, we talked about, group policies and those kinds of things. A tool, even if you try to use it with good intentions, you can use that tool poorly and affect your user base. I mean, that whole user acceptance aspect, MFA is not something that you want to enable over the weekend, not tell any of your user base, and then they're really surprised with those secondary authentication mechanisms. It can really, and it can, kind of turn the user base against the security team a little bit, and that's certainly not what we want. I think they'll understand in hindsight, but that's really that relationship that's got to happen with the user base when implementing just about any of these controls, actually.
Exactly right, and that's a very important point that you touched on. Planning, getting end user buy-in is super. It doesn't matter what we're talking about, whether it's endpoint security, whether it is MFA, whether it is incident support, whatever that might be. You certainly want to have the buy-in of the business. You certainly want to understand what your end users, their acceptance, and really want to get them to buy into what you're trying to do, because you can put all these controls in place. If you don't have these alliances, if they're not aligned with you, if you don't have them on your side, that's really a wasted effort at that point from our perspective. So you're exactly right. MFA isn't something that you just want to turn on. You certainly want to do a lot of planning. You certainly want to make sure you identify your use cases. That's the other thing that we find that most companies never do. They don't identify, and in the future potentially what they want to do what they want to use MFA for. Until, again, yes, you start to get into all sorts of scoping issues and all that kind of stuff. But long story short, planning. I mean, do your design, do your proof of concepts, make sure you get your user acceptance down before you start to roll out these things. Absolutely.
Fantastic. So, and just kind of in closing, right? I think when you go into a client that's had a ransomware situation, and of course, once we get them restored, they're operational, and then they're looking at a laundry list of things like this to do. How do you help them?
Yeah. So this is where really sitting down and having a heart-to-heart conversation and really educating the customer comes to play, right? So a lot of times we'll get a customer saying, "Oh, for example, I want a pen test, for example." Well, why do you want a pen test? Well, I'm concerned. I'm either doing this for regulatory reasons, or I'm concerned about security risk.
Pen testing is good. I love it when we ask why. It's not an insult when somebody asks you why you're doing something. It's because they want to help you make sure that you're doing it properly, or that there's other opportunities there. But I think that, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but why is such an important thing. And I hope people feel comfortable when we say, why are you buying that product, or why are you doing that? It's because we're trying to find those synergies of those other things that we can help.
Yeah, I literally have, we've had those kinds of situations all the time where a customer has one product and all of a sudden they say, well, I want to replace that product.
Exactly.
Looking to replace it, because you could literally be heading down the wrong road. I've even seen scenarios where a customer had a good product, then they went and got a bad product, they got breached. And then when we went in there, the systems that had the good product all detected the attack and stopped it. The systems that had the bad product all failed. So at the end of the day, we try to be consultative with these things, right? We don't try to be product related folks, really.
Right.
What is the actual problem you're trying to solve? Because the customer's notion about how they fix that certain issue may not necessarily be the right one. That's where we try to advise them. We first of all educate them on here's really how you deal with these issues. Here's how your peers are dealing with these issues. Once we've gotten that customer to understand that this is our thought pattern, then we can get into strategies and solutions on, okay, as it pertains to you, here is how we would go about that. And obviously there's not a one size fits all, but out of the typical things that we've seen in most environments, that if they were doing right, not that it would completely eliminate these threats, but it would certainly reduce their exposure to it. So that's kind of how we go about it.
Thank you. And absolutely, I love that there's no one size fits all. I always say there's no macaroni and cheese recipe for how you're supposed to do this. And a lot of folks will try to follow these guides or frameworks and those things. But one of the things that they miss, I think to your earlier point, is those frameworks don't know where you're starting out from. There's all of this stuff that you've already got going on, that when somebody, a consultant can come in and take a look at what you're doing and why you're trying to do it, and we can align the stuff that you've got on the truck, we can make it, operationalize it, make it better. And then as we move forward, we can strategically acquire additional pieces of technology, or maybe it's just a process that needs to change. Or consistently, I know we often act as therapists for a lot of organizations that we go into, because it's like, you guys need to talk to these guys and work how the handoff works. I mean, a lot of that, it sounds silly, but it's not a huge technology solution in a lot of cases. It's literally the process needs to be defined, and then there needs to be some metrics that allow it to be, managed and optimized.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, one of the things that we always advocate is having a trusted advisor, right? And for whatever the initiative is, get a third party opinion. One of the things I tell most of our customers is, certainly you guys are focused on keeping the lights on, bringing home the bacon. The last thing you're thinking about is for the most part, is what are the threats I'm going to be exposed to these days, unless that's your design role. For the most part, we're focusing on keeping the lights on, the business, and all that good stuff. Having a trusted third party is always a good idea, regardless of the maturity of the organization, because there might be a better approach to really solving that problem without breaking the bank. There might be a much more palatable, and that way you can start to get the relevant teams to the table. The issue is what are the strategies for solving it? You get a consensus, and then you kind of run with that pretty much. So you're exactly right. I'm a huge fan of whiteboarding and really understand what's the root cause of why we're trying to do what we're doing. What are the benefits? And then let's not just throw out the baby with the bathwater scenario. So
beautiful. No, I appreciate it, Sunday. So I love the fact that when we talk about these pieces and parts, we talk about them from a programmatic perspective, and I think you've done a great job talking about again, these are things that you need to be thinking about, not necessarily absolutely everything, but I think if we try to do absolutely everything, then you get this paralysis by analysis type of approach. But these are some things that you can immediately go after, take a look at yourself, hopefully before any kind of ransomware threat would manifest itself. And then, of course, if you need help, we are happy to do that. And again, absolutely. Just any closing remarks, Tunde?
No, I guess in summary, really, again, there's no silver bullet when it comes to security. Now, there's no one solution. I've seen some vendors will make that claim. There's no such thing. The idea here is we're not looking for absolute security. Nobody ever gets that. But the concept is adequate security, really. So that should how you select your controls, how you implement controls. Obviously, the concept of layered security is still relevant it's not going anywhere. As long as you do these foundational things, I'm still a huge proponent of those foundational things that every business should be doing. As long as you're doing that with a certain level of maturity, you'll be in good shape. I mean, we're not saying it'll absolutely prevent every single threat out there, but it's really going to exponentially raise the level of difficulty or the level of effort the attackers are going to have to again achieve their objectives in your environment. So that's literally it.
Thanks so much. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We were really happy to be here. Thank you, Tunde, so much. And Tunde's white paper that he put out on how to protect yourself from ransomware is available with a lot of other great assets at InsightCDCT.com. Thank you guys so much. Thanks, Tunde.
All right, thanks. Have a good day, everyone.